Okay, let's start. So, some announcements. The final exam is Tuesday from 8 to 11 of exam week. For the project presentations, they haven't given me a room yet because they want to reserve later once they know more precisely how many rooms they need for each class, etc., etc. They do these every year, but in the end, they do the reservation. But they have tentatively labeled a room from 12 to 3 and from 4 to 7 on Wednesday of exam week, so the day after the final exams. Okay, there will be 2 3-hour sessions. Each 3-hour session normally can fit 15 to 16 presentations. We have about 32 projects. So people who have, the project, I will give a sign-up sheet so that people can choose when they prefer to present the project, in which one of the 2 sessions. And you just need to come to the one of the 2 sessions in which you are presenting, okay? So this is for the logistics. There are some people that have requested special accommodations for the final, typically more time. I put the reservation in. I don't have the answer yet for the same reason. That is, they need to look at all the room availabilities, and then they will get back to me, I think, in a couple of weeks with the final confirmation. Okay? So this is it for the project presentations. The project presentation, if you're curious, is about a 10-minute presentation in which people give an overview of the project. Normally I want at least one projected slide that gives me the name of the project members, etc., because I will be taking notes, obviously, while you present the project. And after this slide, usually people give a brief introduction about the motivation of the app and, what are the key pieces of it by presenting a couple of slides. I mean, this varies, and I don't have a strictly set guideline. It depends also a little bit on the app, no? There are people that present 3-4 slides, people that only present 1. This is followed by a demo of the app, okay? So that you demo it. The purpose of the presentation from my point of view is this. I want to see essentially what the app is, what the functionality is, and what ingredients went into it, why it was easy, what was hard, so that when we look at the code, we know essentially how to use the app, right? If they give you a random app and you don't know how it's supposed to be used, it's very difficult then to read the code or test it, because you don't know what to expect, okay? But if we know that, it's much easier to then look at the critical pieces, test it, or read the pieces of code and do all that. Okay? So this is for the finals week. Any question up to this point? Okay. There is homework for due Monday. I'm sure you all know. Again, it shouldn't be hard, but there is a little bit more code to put together than for the previous homework assignments that were clearly faster to do. One small trick that I forgot to mention, and that maybe somebody posts it to Piazza more clearly, that would be appreciated, is this. In order to do HTTP calls, you need to use this Google Volley library. Right? This is what we have been using. Now, the library is not part of any project by default. And so if you want to use the library, you need to insert in the application.gradle file, app.gradle file, the requirement that we are using Volley. I think I went over it, or maybe not, but I think I explained it in when it came to homework 3. But then, because it was already in the sample code for homework 3, you may not have noticed, right? Because it's one of the many things people overlook. But if you start an app fresh and try to use Volley, you can't use it until you add this requirement to the Gradle file. So I just wanted to mention it so that it's clear. Okay. Any questions up to this point? No. Is the pace of class fast, slow? Fast, raise your hand. No. Slow, raise your hand. So, okay. I mean, as long as one of you only say slow, I wanted to play the joke, of making these videos but I haven't done it yet. But you can listen to me. I wonder if on YouTube you can play me on fast forward. Okay. So, what I want to do today is to talk a little bit about JavaScript and talk a little bit about the structure of what goes into the app built with Cordova. So we always have font problems with things being too small. Sorry. No, that's... 1 second, I just need to prepare the windows, right. Okay, so last time we were playing with the HTML that goes into it. But at this point, I want to talk about the JavaScript that enables you to do the layout on the screen. And first, I think it's useful to actually consider JavaScript as a language in itself and explain to you a little bit how it is done. So, if you want to code in JavaScript, a very easy way to do it, because you need some way to run your JavaScript, is to say that you want to view the developer tools and you want to view the JavaScript console. Okay, we may not care about the page we are loading. We can even load about blank. Okay, which is a blank page, I guess. But here we are given a JavaScript console where we can type comments. For example, we can say var a is equal to hello. Okay, so I'm defining a variable a, and it has been undefined just because that statement has no output, but a got its value, right? And then you can say var b is equal to 2 plus 3, okay, and b gets this value, okay? So the basic data types in JavaScript are, numbers, strings, and well, I think those are the sort of two basic data types, elementary and truth values. Okay, so just to confuse us, because in Python they are capital and in Java they are lowercase. Are they lowercase in Java? True and false? Yes, they are. I always get incredibly confused. But so here I believe that they are. Hey, what is the?
Is it Java camel case and Python snake case?
Wait. So this doesn't work. It doesn't seem to be having Boolean values as primary values. I didn't notice until now. Why not? No, this is not possible. Sorry. Wait a moment. Okay, it's lowercase, but it just doesn't offer it as autocompletion, which was confusing me. Okay, but so it's true and false in lowercase in Java. So these are the basic values, but then JavaScript is actually a full-fledged language, and I would like to reuse a moment some slides that were prepared for a class of some time ago, and that I will give you, that gives a sort of a fast introduction to the whole language. Okay, that I think is good to know for JavaScript. I will skip some of the later parts because we will essentially be using somewhat lightweight JavaScript in this class. For each language there is a simple way to use it and a way in which you use all possible features. And here we keep essentially to some lightweight features. But first of all, I want to tell you at least how this works as a language. So it was a language that was invented very, very quickly by Brendan Eich, and to be able to create something that could run in a browser and modify the content of the browser, essentially doing something dynamic in HTML. And it was considered as something with which you could write small hacks for a while, right? And only later it became really the language on which a lot of the applications that people use are written, actually. And the first great such app was Gmail, actually. Gmail was the first app that at large scale demonstrated that you could write for the web in an entirely different way. You could write code that would run in the browser and talk to the backend, not by loading new pages, but by loading snippets of data back and forth in order to render, in order to build a dynamic application. Okay, before Gmail, all the various webmail applications were done in such a way that they produced an HTML page, and when you would click somewhere, they would load us some other view or react to some other view by redrawing in a fairly static way. For example, I used to use a squirrel mail in the good old days, right? And that was done in such a way that you had a list of messages. You click on one, this would load the page corresponding to the message, and so on and so forth. So it took some time to develop from this sort of smaller language to really people understanding that they could write essentially code that would run on the user's browsers. And I think that the transition is only happening in part. There are many pieces of software that really can be delivered as applications that run in the user's browser. And we are only now, we're seeing only part of this transformation, I think. A lot more can be done. Part of the slowness is that, there are some standards and there are some difficulties in changing everybody's browsers to be up to, there is a certain lag time in years, right? For example, it's only in the last maybe 4 or 5 years that browsers have given you a good way to access the local storage on the computer itself, so that you can write applications that store considerable amounts of data on the computer itself. At any rate, so Java and JavaScript are different things. Okay, they don't have anything in common. In fact, in many ways they couldn't be more different. Okay. Is this big enough? Well, I'm afraid I cannot do very much. By the way, this is a presentation I prepared by one of the Cormac students that now I think graduated. So, but he somehow didn't write his name anywhere. So I'm reusing it, giving him credit, but I don't know to whom you give credit in this moment. So there are numbers, there are strings, there are booleans, and that I told you already. So this is the basic data. Wow, this is really small on this screen. I wonder why. Okay, there are variables. Let me see if I can do this. No. So if I do this, I cannot scroll. Okay, this may be better. So there are some built-in functions, math, max, etc. One of the problems I have with the JavaScript, and you will see me struggling all the time, is that many of these built-in functions have fairly incomprehensible names compared to decent languages. They were invented a bit in a hurry. And so, for example, the way to manipulate arrays, etc., are far from obvious, unfortunately. And I forget them all the time, I have to admit. Control, you have while loops. Okay. Note that this uses essentially a Java-like or C-like convention. So when you have a conditional, you enclose the conditional in around parentheses, and then you use braces in order to define the stanza that gets executed. Okay. So this is in a way very, very C-like. Then you have for loops. Okay. You know that in Python you are very tempted to loop on lists in smart ways, right? In Python, you say for x in list, and this, iterates. This is a for loop in which the variable x gets in turn all the values of the list in order, right? That's the way you do loops in Python. Instead, in JavaScript, you have to think that you are back towards C. When you want to loop, you typically loop on an integer array that you increment explicitly, either with as in this case, a plus, or with a plus plus operator that increments by 1, okay? But so you typically increment over integer, iterate over integer arrays. I will tell you in a moment why this is important. If you your equivalent of your printf function that is useful obviously only during debugging, because this prints to the console, which nobody sees unless you're in debugging mode, is this console.log. This is extremely useful to use because when you develop code, just as I did now, you can always access the JavaScript console, right? You have your web page that is running, and you can open the development tools and look at the JavaScript console. And so you can see at all the outputs that you print while you do things. I will show you later how to do that. But in general, you have access to fairly good debugging tools in browsers for JavaScript. It used to be a nightmare many years ago. It used to be very hard to actually figure out what was going on, and now it's instead very well done. You can set breakpoints, run the code one by one, inspect the value for the variables. So the debugger is really, really nice. Actually, superior to your experience in developing for Android, I believe, in terms of tools. It just has become so mainstream, that the developing in JavaScript is needed. So you will. One of the interesting things of JavaScript is that it has various ways of testing for equality. There is a double equal and triple equal, and so you start to get confused. Why do we want to use triple equal? And so this is perhaps the one thing that sometimes bites people in JavaScript. That is, Java is a typed language, Python is an untyped language, and JavaScript is an untyped language. But Python and JavaScript have taken different conventions. So in Python, if you add a string to an integer, you actually get an error, okay? And if you compare a string to an integer, they're always different. And this kind of works, okay? In Java, you have automatic typecasts, so much so that if you want to convert a number to a string, what you can do is use the sum operator, and this does a typecast from integer to string. Now, in Java, if you write the empty string plus an integer with a plus sign, sort of like this, where a is an integer, empty plus a. What happens is that a gets converted first to a string, and then the two strings are concatenated, so that people have taken these as a Java shorthand for converting numbers to strings, okay? Now, this works in Java, and people keep their sanity, because the kind of typecast that is done is independent of the particular value of the variables. You can statically examine your code and say, I know that a is an integer because you declared it to be an integer. So whenever you run this particular line of code, the same typecast will happen all the times. Okay? Now, instead, JavaScript fell into an unfortunate combination of factors. It's not typed, so when you give me a variable a, when you pass me a variable a as input to my function, I actually cannot predict which type is stored in A, right? It can be anything, right? I don't need to declare the type of my parameters for a function, for example, okay? But it uses typecasts in a way that depends on the values of the content of the variables. Let's see how. Okay, let's see first what happens, and then how other languages avoid it. Is useful to look at it. So if I do 100 plus string 1, this considers it as string concatenation. If I do 100 minus string 1, JavaScript instead thinks, hey, I don't know minus for strings, but I know minus for numbers. So to try to be as helpful as possible, let's try to see if I can convert everything to a number. So you can also do the typecast in the opposite direction, right? And says, well, can I convert the string 1 to a number? Yes, I can. Otherwise, it would throw an error, right? But yes, I can. it's actually the number 1, and then it does the minus, okay? So, okay, let me leave it at that a moment. Just stare at it and observe how seemingly crazy it is, okay? And so, yes, if you do hello minus 100, it tries to convert hello to a string, it fails, and so this is not a number, okay? Now, how can you get into trouble with this? Well, for example, you write a piece of math, and depending on whether you pass me a string or a number, I will behave in very different ways, right? Suppose I write a function that takes x and y and returns x plus y. A function that gets x and returns x plus 1. It would be a sort of stupid function, okay? But suppose I write it nevertheless. It's called my inc function. If I write such an inc function, the problem is that if you pass me a number, I increment it. But if you pass me a string, I add 1 at the end of it. And I never complain in either case. And in one case, I give you back an integer, and in another case, I give you back a string. So you can write code that works, but actually does entirely different stuff depending on the type of the numbers that come in, okay? And this causes a lot of subtle bugs. Imagine that I agree with my MSI tutor that he's kind enough to write my backend, cloud backend for my service, okay? And so he gives me this cloud backend in which he gives me this data in JSON that I decode, okay? But because of some misunderstanding at some point, I think that for the number of students enrolled in a class, I think that he's giving me an integer, but he gives me a string instead, and I should convert it to an integer myself. I can pass it through my mathematical functions. My mathematical functions can do completely meaningless mixes of strange string concatenation and never complain, and then I can store the results in the database or display to the user, and nothing can happen. Nothing bad can happen. So, what is that makes it that makes JavaScript so much nastier when it comes to typecasts than either Java or Python? In Java, typecasts are there, but they're predictable because everything has a type, because it's declared. And so while you have typecasts, whenever you execute a particular line of code, the same cast will happen. It doesn't depend on the parameters with which you happen to be called. In Python, you have dynamic typecasts that depend on the type of the data, right? You don't have, but the point is that you don't have a lot of them. Just about the only common typecast that people use all the time is that integer can be cast to floats. So if you multiply an integer by a floating point, what you get is a floating point, and you don't need to first convert an integer to floating point. I think that to many of us, this is such second nature that integers and floats can be mixed that we don't think twice about it. But that's the only really typecast that you have in Python, okay? So Java avoids it by typing. Python avoids it by having only few typecasts that actually happen, okay? But if you go in the middle of it, in which you try to do all possible typecasts, but things are untyped, what you obtain is a language where what happens, so not only the type of the variables, but really the kind of operations that happen between the values depend dynamically on the values. And this creates a lot of difficulties. Okay? So, for example, look at these. The empty string is equal to 0. This 0 string, this is different because these are two different strings. Is it true that the 0 is equal to the empty string? This is true. Why? Well, because in this case, JavaScript tries to say, well, what is the equivalent of the empty string if it was a number? You know, JavaScript tries to find what is the easiest common value between the two expressions. And so if it has a number and a string, it tries to convert them to a string. Okay? And so, I mean, you can stare at it and you can try to understand the reason why these things are this way. But in some way, it's a nice exercise. You know, it's like being experts of an arcane body of law, I guess. And in some other case, you know, you can consider it a little bit of insanity. And you would like to be able to test whether things are equal or different without actually the help of this typecasting that is meddling the issue behind you, you know? You would like, for example, to know that the integer 0 is different from the string 0. I mean, if you had wanted them to be considered equal, you would have known which one is a string and you would have converted it to an integer or vice versa. Okay? So there is a solution out of these, and that is, sorry, the solution is not explained there, but you have two versions of equality. You have double equality and triple equality. Double equality tries to be helpful by doing typecasts, and triple equality is instead strict. So it just looks at the values, it doesn't do any typecast, and then it does a comparison. And you have equally the triple difference, you know, it's like exclamation mark equals equals. That is a check for difference without trying to convert to the same, to comparable types. Okay? You can define functions, okay? Functions work essentially in the same way as usual. Let me define a couple of functions to show you that there are a couple of syntaxes possible. So if you want to define a function, you can do two things. One is that you can say function f of x return x plus 1, something like that. Okay, and then I can say f of 3, and this should return 4. Yes, okay. And another way that is quite common, and I use it very frequently, you can say variable g is equal to function x return x plus 1. Okay, so I've defined a function of an argument x that returns x plus 1. So this portion of code from here to here, this is an unnamed function. It's something that you don't use a lot in Python, but that really comes from languages such as Lisp and Scheme that served as inspiration to JavaScript. So in these languages, just as you can, write a numeric expression, 3 plus 4, etc., you can write a functional expression. A function, if you study the mathematics of programming languages, is essentially an operator that takes some arguments and produces some result. And functions have the right to exist even though they may not have a name. So in good old languages, you could define functions only because they had a name. That is what I do above. I define a function f. But how can you define a function without necessarily bothering without giving it a name? You use the function keyword, okay? You say function, then you give the list of arguments, and then you give the body of the function. And what you obtain is a functional value. What we would have been thrilled to have in Java in many cases, right? In JavaScript you have it, and you can assign it to variables. So here I'm assigning to a new variable g this functional value. And g has as value a function. What does it mean? Well, I can ask what g is, and it will tell me that it's a function. And I can also say, please apply g to 5, and it will do so, and it will give me the value 6. Okay? So in JavaScript, functions are really first-order values. And we will use very, very, very often this second form for functions. In this class, for some reasons that I'll tell you, we will use it way more frequently than the first one. Most of the functions we will be defining, we define them without giving them a name, and then we assign them to particular things that we need to have around. Okay? It's so great. Now, what happens if we do something like this? We define a variable that is called top level, then we print it inside one function. We define a variable that contains top level, and then we define it in we redefine it inside a function. Okay, so let's see what happens. So when you want to run code, you can just cut and paste it. Okay, so notice that in print variable it has value top level, and in test what we print is test. Okay, so essentially when we the local variable defined inside a function overrides the global value defined inside a file. Okay, now this slides go into quite a bit of depth in scoping. And I'm not exactly sure that I want to go into all of that, okay? I want to essentially give you these slides for reference, but then for this class I want to go a little bit faster than that. Here there is an incredible number of examples of how these various scopings function. And let me follow my my impression and continue, because I don't think we will need it. So look at those slides, try them out. Actually, this is a good exercise for you to understand the intricacies of the language. In this class, I will essentially give you a way to write code that avoids a lot of these fine points, because and so we don't need to know very much about scoping of variables in what we will be doing. Okay. Now, what is objects? What is an object? An object is a fundamental thing in JavaScript, and it is essentially a container for labels that have values. For example, an object there has a label color that has value gray, a label name that has value spot, and a size that has value 46. Okay? You can create objects very easily. You can simply say, when you, sorry, I just want to have it a bit more centered. So you can say var a, or maybe, well, why not? Var a is equal to an empty object, okay? And so this defines an empty object. And then I can say a dot color is equal to red, and a dot, I don't know, length, well, or, you know, height, I don't know, whatever, is equal to 45.6. And so you don't need to declare, as in Java, you know, what are the possible fields of an object. This is a completely dynamic language. You first create an object, and then you can fill it with content as you go, okay? And if you ask what A is, it will tell you that it's an object that has two attributes, and you can explore it in nice ways in the JavaScript console. And this is something one often does. So you will see that in a way, you can think at a correspondence between a JavaScript object and a Python dictionary. They look somewhat similar, okay? And that's why JSON, this language that we have been using to communicate between cloud and the mobile, works also well between Python and JavaScript. The one difference you have to keep in mind, though, is that Python dictionaries in general are way more general. In a Python dictionary, anything that of which you can compute a hash can act as key to a dictionary, okay? So a dictionary in Python is like a hash table. Anything that is of a hashable type, so of which the system has, or you has defined a hashing function, can serve as a key to a Python dictionary, okay? Instead, in JavaScript, objects are a little bit more constrained because they are meant to be, programming language features. And so in JavaScript, in an object, the tags have to be strings. And this is important. So a typical error that people do, including myself every now and then, is this. You have you define a dictionary in Python that looks very innocuous, but you are using integers as keys, and it looks fine, you know. For example, you have a dictionary that at some point represents, you know, I don't know, the courses in each quarter. And so you say 1, and then you say a list of courses, for instance. 2, where these 1, 2 are integers. If you read it in JavaScript, this will be transformed to string tags, okay? Because all the tags, all the fields of an object have to be are essentially strings, okay? So these are objects that are quite simple, okay? You can access them also by using this square bracket thing. For example, you can say var b is equal to color, right? And then you can say a of b. And you get red, okay? So you can index them as if they were sort of dictionaries in Python, in fact. I mean, they do look similar. They certainly have a common inspiration, okay? You can delete members of an object if you want to get rid of them. This is sometimes useful if they take a lot of space. You know, you can remove pieces you don't like. You can have arrays. Okay, you can declare them very simply using a notation that again is very similar to Python. You use square brackets to put the list of stuff, and you can index. You can fish out elements of arrays by using again this square bracket notation with an integer inside. Okay. You can ask for the length of an array. What you should not do is this. You should never loop on an array, even though arrays are very similar to Python arrays. The one catch that you should never be careful about is that you should never iterate over an array with a for loop that says for x in array. Okay, let me show you a moment how to iterate over an array in the proper and improper way and why this works. So let me say that my array A is equal to, I don't know, cat, dog, bird, and snail. Slug, what am I doing? We are UCSC. Okay? Great. Now this is an array. What is it if I look at it? Well, it turns out it's not quite an array in the way you imagine it. It looks like an object inside. Okay? So arrays fundamentally are like objects, but in this case that do have integers as labels. So this is sort of the one exception. And so they work in weird ways. For example, I can say A of 100 is equal to I don't know, what's like a worm. Why not? Okay? And now, what is A? Well, it's this very funny object. Okay? So, you see, because if you ask what is A in shape of an object, it's this. And now we have created a hole in it. I'm not claiming that this is something incredibly useful that you will be doing all the time. But it's there. Okay? So now let me get a bit of a saner array, okay, without holes into them. So let me just cut and paste, you know, this array, I guess, up to here. I want to show you something about iteration that you have to be careful about. So, well, okay, maybe var b. Well, maybe this was already defined. Okay, so B contains now this array, and then I can do in the improper way. I can do for x in for x in b. I don't remember if this syntax works, but let me try console log x. Since it's wrong, I never use it, so I forgot whether it works. Let me see whether it does. Yes, it does. Okay, so you say, but this is beautiful, you know, that certainly gives me a very pleasant way of iterating over an array, you know, super nice. What is the problem? That in JavaScript, it's one of these languages, you know that you have subclassing or subobjecting, however you want to call it, if you have objects, right? So I think that he's giving me an object of a certain kind, but because he has produced it in a special way, it contains a little bit more stuff. Okay? For example, let me do something slightly subversive, okay? I want to do an array that has a function that adds 1 to the elements, well, okay, that, what? These are strings, so what should I do? This is silly. What can I have it do? A suggestion? No. How do you capitalize a string in JavaScript, by the way? I forgot. To uppercase. Thank you, yeah. I'm sorry. I have a particularly bad memory for all these things. So I'm very appreciated. So let me write a function that will return well, let me be a bit faster, okay? I will give you something sophisticated later, but let me simply say b.f is equal to a function that takes an element x and return x plus 1. Sorry for being so trivial, okay? But now I'm saying that my array b has a function associated with it. Now this is perfectly fine, okay? And if I iterate on it, the problem is that now there is this funny thing f in it, okay? And the problem is that very, very often the arrays you are passed by other people or by other pieces of the code are not actually clean arrays, but they're arrays with other stuff added to them. And so the real way to iterate over an array is this. For variable I is equal to 0, I smaller, it's like in C, that b dot length, okay? No, sorry. I didn't get the autocomplete. I plus plus, okay? So I can do this, and I can say console log of what? Of b with I, okay? And that will do what you expect the array iteration to do, okay? So I just want to explain you this particular gotcha that's there, okay? And with this said, I think we somehow know enough to start diving into the code. This class is not mainly about JavaScript, and so we will be using it as something where we can actually, write code before we fully know how a language works, which is what you do in both computer languages and human languages when you actually want to really learn them. Okay, so I want to go back to this app and show you the structure of the execution of the code. Yes?
So the array doesn't necessarily have to have the same type for all the elements in it?
No. Yes.
So where is the function being stored? It's not being stored in the fourth spot of the array, is it?
Yes, because the array is not truly an array. If you look at what it pretends to be an array to you and to users. But if you look at what an array is, let me type it again. What is this thing? It is essentially an association of labels to values. Let me say one thing, okay? In JavaScript, there is a difference between the way you understand the language and the implementation. The implementation, because JavaScript is such a crucial language in today's world, they have optimized incredibly the implementation at all levels. So the data structure that actually is used to store these arrays, I do not know it, and it changes. And the author of the how it is called, the software behind the Chrome browser, not Gecko, but how is it called? The I mean, there is this browser engine behind. At any rate, the authors of these browser engines have incredibly optimized the implementation of JavaScript interpreters, okay? And Chrome battles with Safari, then battles with the other browser, with the Firefox to have the best JavaScript engines. So I'm not talking about the real implementation of an array. But the logical implementation of an array is that it's just a bunch of integers that are mapped to values, and it can contain other stuff, okay? And the reason why it behaves like an array is that it has it belongs to, it has a proto field that says array, which means essentially that it inherits. I don't want to go into that because I don't want to complicate the class. I mean, if you like, I can do a lecture later on these. But essentially, inheritance in JavaScript works by having objects that inherit from other objects, okay? So this array has a proto that is similar to a prototypical array that gives it the ability to be accessed in various ways. Yes?
I'm not sure if we're using the latest version of Java, but in the latest version of Java, instead of using of instead of in, the previous version, everything will work.
Sorry? What did you say?
In the latest version of Java, which I'm not JavaScript,
okay.
we're using, but if you use the keyword of instead of in the previous for loop, everything will work the way you'd expect it to.
Okay, great. Yes. Yeah. So for x of a. Oh, okay. I actually didn't know that. That's the problem. Once you learn to do things one way, you never know whether there is another way. But so let me look at the structure of the code now. So I want to go into index.js, where I've given you a sort of minimal application. So it has to. This looks very complicated as something that does essentially nothing and acts just as a scaffold. But I want to explain you what I do. jQuery is this JavaScript library that gives you access to the DOM tree and gives you a bunch of utility methods. And I will introduce them when they are needed. But one of the primary ones is simply this. If you enclose something in jQuery, that something will be executed when everything else is ready. Okay? It's just a trick to ensure that the code you put here is executed when everything else is initialized. I think I should add a parenthesis. Browsers work in a very different way from programming languages. In a programming language, you write your beautiful code, your code is compiled or is executed, but even if it's just executed as in Python, normally you parse the whole file before you start running it. So there is absolutely no problem about order in which you do things. When you load a web page instead, you start parsing the code before the page is fully rendered. Okay, the browser tries to do things in order and do them as quickly as possible. So if you notice, the problem is that in index.html, I'm loading index.js before I specify what is the content of the page. Okay, so if you don't do anything special, the browser will try to run my JavaScript code before the HTML code is interpreted. Okay? So this is undesirable in general, and so I want to wait to actually activate my JavaScript until when the HTML is also there, because the problem is that otherwise from the JavaScript you cannot refer to the HTML you have. Okay? So you have to introduce this element of delay. So what I do is this. I say jQuery, and when jQuery is ready, I write everything in this single function. Okay? And I do two things. I say my application is equal to the value of app, and then I call initialize on my application. Let me show you why I do that. I have this function app that I can call and will define a bunch of stuff. So everything interesting we do will be inside this function app. And then once the function app is called, I assign to app the value of app. Okay. Maybe I need to do a smaller example. Okay, so let me do one thing. Let me copy. No, okay. Let me minimize a bit these things in between, and so that we see the whole thing without all this detail. Okay. One second. So when I'm done loading, I say capital app is equal to the result of calling app. Look at what app does. App is a function that when called, it defines a variable self that is an object. Okay? This is done to mimic Python, but there is a specific reason why I do this. This is very non-standard, okay? I do this and other people do this, but this is not a classical way of writing things, but is a way that I think is incredibly convenient, and so I want to teach you this particular shortcut. So I'm defining an object self. I'm then saying self is configured is equal to false, so self.this is equal to that. You know, I mean, I basically assign fields to this object self. Self is an object, a generic object, okay? At the end, I return self. So when I do this assignment at the end, when I say capital app is equal to app, okay, after defining the variable app, I will have put this object I define in this function inside this variable app. Okay? And then I can call an initialize method of app. So first of all, observe what I do. There are two stages of this. First, understanding that it can work, and then understanding why it's not a stupid idea to do all this complication. To see why this can work, it's a little bit easier. You can think that this is perhaps a somewhat contorted way of defining the content of an object app. Okay? So at the end of this, for instance, once this finishes running, I don't want to write it here permanently, but for example, I can ask for app.initialized or app is configured, right? And this will be defined once I run. Okay? So let me in fact run Cordova and show you this in action, this mechanism in action. When I run Cordova, what will happen is this. The browser will load the page. It will load first the JavaScript because it's in the header, then it will load whatever HTML content there is, okay? And then it will run this code first. I mean, it will define app to be null, and then it will run this code. This code will run the function app that will fill in the self object and return it. And it will assign the value of that object that I build to app in capital letters. Okay? Yeah.
And that will reassign the global variable.
Sorry?
That will reassign the global variable?
It will reassign this global variable, yes. Okay? Because since I haven't declared a local copy to this function here, you have access to the global variable. Okay? So let me first see this mechanism in action and then comment on it. So to run it, I cannot, I mean, I guess this page I could load it as a simple page, but let me anyway run it via Cordova so I know that it sort of works in the usual way, right? So I say Cordova run browser. This will run the page. It's the same page where we have been building the other time, okay? But now I can inspect. Okay, and I can click on the console, and this is a JavaScript console, okay? Now, one of the reasons of why I do things in this way is this. You notice that at a big level, I'm doing a big mess with this self-object. I return it and assign it to this variable called app. Why do I bother doing that? And one of the answers is it makes debugging a lot easier. Because now that I'm here, this object app is accessible. And it's accessible along all its fields. So, for example, I can ask whether app is configured, and it happens to be true, right? I can even do better. I can write app, okay, and this gives me the object, and then I can go look at it. I can see all its fields, okay? So essentially, doing things in this way, I'm not saying it's the only way, but it is one way so that when you debug your code, whatever you assign here will be accessible. Now you may ask, but why didn't you just define a bunch of global variables, okay? This is because I want to avoid all possible name clashes, okay? I don't want to define global variables that might clash with the library names or with other stuff that people might use or with anything else. So what I'm doing is this, essentially. I'm building my own special scope. This is why I have app is a function. You know that when you scopes of declaration of variables are tied to function declarations. So I declare this function that I call app in lowercase so that it can create a new scope in which I can define all my various fields without name clashes, okay? And I define this object self entirely at my pleasure, okay? And I assign all the fields of it in the way I like. I returned this object self that was created without any possible name clash in the sort of proper way, and I assign it, and then I assign it to this capital app that then will make it accessible to me at all times during debugging. This is really quite convenient, okay? Again, it's not the only way of doing things. It's just a habit that I picked up actually. There is some story behind it, Massimo Di Piero, with whom I often work, originally wrote a big piece of JavaScript in another way. And at some point, he rewrote it in a way that is somewhat similar to this. And he told me, he raved about me how much better it was. And then I tried this method, I think, in the last couple of editions of my web class. And I came to really like this method because of the easy access to debugging methods and how much it disorganized my mind when I was writing the code. And then I made this adaptation to Cordova, which is slightly different from what I teach in 183 because things are called in a slightly different way, and I will go into some of the details of the difference later, okay? But essentially, so this has a bit of history. It's not used by a lot of people as far as I know, but is, very convenient, okay? There is another thing that why we do things in this way. In JavaScript, there is a sort of habit to use an object that is called this to refer to the current scope, okay? The problem is that what this means is generally defined in a complicated way or in a not always intuitive way. And instead, using something that we call self that does not have a meaning in JavaScript gives us much more hand control on what we put into this object self and we return it. We are building really an object in a much more controlled way. So let's see. So this part of code, essentially, you never change. What you do is that you change the particular way in which you fill this self-object to write an app, okay? Let me explain what I'm doing. This variable is configured. It's not compulsory to use it, but it's simply something I use often to know whether I have already done some initializations or not. I will show you now how this works. I define a function initialize that does the following. It adds an event listener for the device-ready event that when this event is launched, it calls self on device-ready. So this is a peculiarity of Cordova. Cordova, when it comes up on a phone, it needs to do a lot of stuff. No? It needs to initialize your JavaScript, Java interfaces, load them. I don't know what else it needs to do, but there is some stuff and some delay. So your JavaScript is loaded very fast, but it's not yet able to interact with the rest of the application. Okay? So how do? You generally don't want to do stuff before the environment is set up. So what I do is this. Once I define my app object, I call initialize. All initialize does is it adds an event listener that says, when the device ready event is fired, please call this function of mine. JavaScript has an event model. You can generate events and you can attach listener to events, more or less in the way in which you could add listeners to click events in Java in Android. Okay? So in this case, in the documentation of Cordova, there is a promise to you to fire an event that is called the device ready whenever whatever initializations have done, and we catch that event and we do that. Okay. What do we do on device ready? So this callback is called once Cordova has finished its own initialization. Okay. So what I do is that I log that I've gotten the initialization just for debugging purposes, okay? And then I say that I want to show this Vue div in which I put my code, and then I say that I'm configured. So what is this business about showing this Vue div? So we will render the screen via, Android has essentially some way of converting from XML specification to how the screen is filled. For us, the sort of same role is done by this Vue that will be translating from our data structures to what is laid out on the screen. Okay? So if you look at my HTML code in a little bit more detail, you see that I do something like this. My body contains a div that has an ID of Vue div. This will be the div where we do all our dynamic layout. There is a problem that at the beginning, when the browser loads this stuff, it does not immediately understand that the HTML code that is in there is not really true normal HTML code. I mean, in this case it is actually, because I was doing very simple examples for you. But in other cases, it can contain particular layout directives that I will cover that say, for example, how to lay out a list, how to lay out this, how to lay out that. This will be able, while so far this is normal HTML code, in the future it will contain some other stuff. And if you just tell the browser to display that stuff, waiting for it to be properly laid out by Vue, you will get garbage on the screen for a fraction of a second, okay, which is not very pleasant. So what I'm saying is something like this. This Vue div, where all my layout happens, at the beginning has a style that says display none. This tells the browser, I'm telling you this code, but you shouldn't actually show anything. Okay, so display is an attribute of tags that enforces the rendering. I told you that in native Android, you can define the visibility of each view as visible, invisible, or gone, right? And this is a bit of the equivalent of saying that this is actually gone. So it's not there in the layout. It doesn't take any space. It doesn't exist. So when this is laid out first, nothing of that div is visible. And I do that in order to avoid momentary garbage on the screen. So the thing that I want to do in the JavaScript code is this. Once I get the sign that the initialization is all ready, that both Cordova is ready and jQuery is ready and everything else is ready, what I want to do is I want to say to the browser, okay, now you can show finally your content because it won't be full of garbage anymore. Okay? And so what I do here is that I say that once I get the on-device ready function, I say the Vue div and I call the show method of it. This is, let me write it, this is jQuery. So this is one of my few uses of pure jQuery in my code, okay? In jQuery, $sign is an alias of jQuery. So here, instead of saying jQuery function, I could have written $function, and it would have worked just the same. I could write this if I want. I just find it a bit less clear, but many people do write it this way, okay? So I say $. Inside of the parentheses of the $, you put what is called a selector string. This is a string that looks very much like the CSS specifier. So, you know, I told you that dot class is a way to specify something of the class, and, you know, hash ID is the way to specify an element that has a particular ID. So in this case, I want to specify, hey, get me the HTML element that has ID woodiv and apply the show method to it. I won't be using a lot of jQuery in this class, but I show you where this comes from in case you need to look it up. Or so if you look at the jQuery documentation, you can find it all, okay, obviously. Where is the documentation? API documentation, okay. And if you want to look at the show method, jQuery show, it's just a bit faster for me to search it than to navigate their site. Okay, so you get the documentation on show, and you also see that there are it belongs to a category of basic effects. There is hide, show, and then there is toggle that toggles the visibility. And you have a gazillion methods by which you can affect the DOM tree in jQuery. Okay, so that's the point of the device ready function. At this point, the only other interesting thing I do in this code is set up Vue. So Vue is this layout framework that will take some data structures and will explain how to lay them out on the screen. And I want now to give you examples of that. So the way you set it up is this. I will define a field that is called self-Vue, okay? And it is equal to a new Vue instance. If you really like, you can put multiple Vue instances on the same page, but I don't think we will ever do that in this class. And you need to specify the behavior of this Vue object, this Vue renderer, by giving it some information. The first thing you need to define is this L attribute, which tells it where does the output have to go. And as you see, I give it the same woodiv that I prepared, right? So I have this woodiv in which all my rendering will take place. You can put HTML code outside of your woodiv. In that case, that will be rendered statically, will never change, and will always be there. In case of these type of applications, normally you don't do that because you want to have a full control of the screen dynamically to do anything you ever want. So your whole screen layout is contained in the woodiv. Okay? So once you have the woodiv, once you have these, I'm redefining delimiters. This is not strictly needed. You can also use the default Vue delimiters, but I'm so used to redefining them because of another class I teach that I redefine them. Essentially, these are delimiters that will enable you to insert content dynamically in a page. We will see later how they behave. I redefine them just to make it more compatible with more ways of generating pages. It's not important. And then I can define some data and some methods. I have defined neither data nor methods because I'm not yet doing any dynamic layout, okay? So now I want to essentially start from zero and do a little bit of dynamic layout. So let me start from a blank page and then play with it. So 1 second, I can do this. So on the one side we will have the HTML and the other the JavaScript. And I'm just used to having, I think, the JavaScript to the right. Come on. Yes. Okay, so let's go here and we can leave the hello class so that at least we know something is rendering. Okay, I can sort of remove everything else and I can say something like a paragraph that says my number is, And then I use, you see these delimiters, that is, this is the opening one and this is the closing one, and then I can say a variable that I call my number, without a lot of fantasy, okay? So this will refer to a variable defined in Vue. What happens if I just run this? Notice that I haven't really defined this variable, okay? So if I just run this, what happens is this. You know, unfortunately, every time I have to relaunch it. And I don't see a lot. My number is, and then I don't see anything. But if I do inspect and I go look at the JavaScript console, Vue is kind enough, and this is one of the things I really like of Vue, that is kind enough to give me very interesting warning or error messages on what's happening. So in this case, it's telling me, warning, the property called my number is not defined on the instance, but is referred during rendering. These are, beautiful, very useful messages. So when you mess up, you have to look at the JavaScript console, and you will look at the Vue output that will tell you in fair detail. This is a huge step forward from other frameworks that I was using a few years ago, in which whenever you made a mistake, basically the mistake was silent, and then you were to figure out, which in many places where in many places you have made actually your mistake, right? I mean, if the thing is, if you have written just a huge bunch of code and you try to use it, it's very annoying to have to chase where the silent errors. In this case, you can see that. So how do we define a variable? Well, we simply go here in the data and we say my number. You see this data. Look first at the shape. To be obvious, what is data? Data is an object, right? It has this brace notation in JavaScript. So, being an object, we can define its various fields, with a colon notation, for instance. We could also say Vue.data is equal to this, but in this case we do this. Okay, so my number is equal to 7. I don't quite know why. Okay, but if we run the code again. And it's a bit annoying that we cannot just reload, but now we see that my number is 7, okay? So we have seen how to inject this very simple content in JavaScript. Now, let's do, and I would like to, in this class and a bit of the next, to do homework for, but instead of doing it the way you are doing it, I want to do it in JavaScript in Vue, okay? So I want to essentially teach you how to do this list of titles and subtitles, and I want to build it by degrees. So instead of my number, which is okay, good, but not so great, I want to say what is my titles, okay? I want to build these a bit by degrees. So now I have something that is a list of stuff, and titles is equal to the New York Times, and why does it complain? Oh, because I use equal instead of colon, I'm sorry. New York Times, Washington Post, I don't know, CNN, and then The Onion. Okay, so these are my titles. I mean, I use short strings just not to get bored. So how do I lay out a string? A list, I'm sorry, okay? So to lay out a list, the way I do it is that, I have this UL tag that means beginning and end of the list. Actually, no, I don't want to do this because, I don't want stupid bullets. I want, for each article, I want essentially a div that will contain the title. Oh boy. Sorry, 1 second. I'm thinking. Div. Let me just build this div around, and then I want to say div class is equal to title, and I want to say that something has to be rendered as a title there. Now, I haven't written the crucial bits of code, but essentially I want to do a loop that will produce many of these divs. Each one will be filled with a title. Now, I want to see whether I remember how to do this. Vue for is equal to T in titles, okay? And then I can just write T, I guess. I hope this works. If not, I will have to show you how to search the documentation. I don't know how to do otherwise. I have this terribly bad memory for all these various constructs, so sometimes I get, confused. It doesn't work. So, great, actually. How do I figure out what is going wrong here? VWarn, property or method T is not defined. Okay, so I admit the defeat and I go to the documentation of VW documentation, and I probably did the for loop wrong. It may be V for instead of V for, right? And I forgot. But suppose I don't know that because I may have forgotten. So you go here and you say the VW instance template syntax, and you say interpolations, directives, arguments, modifiers, VB. Sorry?
List rendering down there.
Where?
List.
Oh, list rendering, right. Thank you. And so you see that my mistake is that I should have used V4 instead of VU4. Okay? Notice that VU is done, the examples are with these double braces, which are the standard delimiters, but I've redefined them. So my mistake is that here, because of absent-mindedness, okay, I've written the wrong thing. So this is the right syntax. If I run this code now, okay, this renders my various titles. And if you inspect the elements, okay, you see that this is exactly what I prescribed for each one of them. Sorry, I need to enlarge a little bit here. Okay. So you see there is a hello class, and then there are 4 divs. Each div will contain a div of class title with the various titles. Okay? And so I can do this. I can say that the outer div is of class newspaper. And so this format will spit out one div of class newspaper per newspaper, and inside that there is a div of class title, and the div of class title will contain the title. And so it renders in this way. So, the list view adapter, the other thing adapter, the craziness stuffy, okay, that's replaced by these few lines of code that we have written. So this is one of the reasons why I think that developing in Cordova is pleasant. Now, you may tell me, this is really cheating, because anyway we have only a title, but in the homework you have both a title and a subtitle, okay? That's why I essentially created already one div inside the other. So let me do that. How do I display information in the format in which I give you the title and the subtitle for each publication, okay? So first, by habit, I first always work on the layout, and then I work on the JavaScript, but you can do vice versa, obviously, if you want, okay? So this is a div of class subtitle. I give these different classes so that I can have these things render in different way. And now we won't be looping over titles anymore, right? We have to loop over newspapers. So the loop will be over P in papers. So, I have to redo a bit of data structure, I guess. P in papers. And then this will be p.title, because P will be an object, right? That way we'll have a title field and a subtitle field. That's the obvious way of, just as in the JavaScript that I send you from the cloud, you have these dictionaries that have title, subtitle, and URL. Then you would imagine that once I receive them in JavaScript, and in fact this will be true, I will have these objects that have a title, subtitle, and URL fields, right? So I say now, here I need to render the paper.subtitle, okay? And we can use then the classes in order to style them differently. Now here, my data needs to look a little bit different, of course, because it has to contain a variable called papers, which has which is a list of, okay, and is a list of what? It's a list of objects in which I have a title. I guess I could write it without. I can simply write title, New York Times, subtitle, I don't know, from New York. Sorry, I'm sort of lacking fantasy, okay? And then we can define another one. A title is, Los Angeles Times, and the subtitle, you can see how I lack fantasy during class, from LA, no? And we could go on and on if we wanted, okay? But let me just define two, okay? So if I do this, I may also decide that titles have to be bold-faced. How do I do that? I go into my main.css and I say that inside the app divider, actually, anything of class title has text weight, font weight, font weight, which is of class, bold, okay? And I can also say that the font size is, 150x%. And okay, I mean, that will do it just to distinguish them, okay? So I need to check, because I always get caught that Compass is running, but Compass is running, so it updated my CSS file. So when I run this thing now, okay, I need to stop and relaunch it, sorry about that. But when I relaunch these, if I haven't made any mistake, I see the titles in boldface and larger, and below it the subtitle, okay? So think at these while you do your homework for, okay? Have an easier life here, I guess. I'm very happy. Now, the problem is that this is all very nice, but this is quite static, right? So I've told you basically how to do a loop based on data, but I haven't told you how to update these data structures. But the way you can update them is by, so let me put here a button that will add a newspaper, okay? Let's see whether I can do it quickly, because the time is a bit running out, but let me see if we can squeeze a button in. I may need TA help for searching, but and actually, instead of doing stuff, let's go towards the app that we want to build. So let me do a button here that contains refresh, as I asked you to do for class. Okay? So this button will display as a button, but now I need to start connecting the code in a slightly more sophisticated way. I want that when you push the button on the screen, something happens in the code, right? And so I need to essentially bind, this is a terminology, I need to bind an event listener in Vue to the click event of the button. In JavaScript, and I apologize if I go a little bit fast, but in JavaScript, objects can generate events, and you can listen to events. And if you look at list of events, there are all kinds of events. There is a click events, on focus event when the mouse gets into the region, on blur when the mouse goes out of a region, on scroll, on this, on that, on device ready, and so elements in HTML that are clicked generate the click event, right? And so I want to associate a function that listens to these. This is very similar in idea to what is done in Android, right? In Android, you have we can define a button, and then we can define via XML what function gets activated. And here we have to do the same thing in Vue. So this is a vClick is equal to, and then I have to, is it written this way? vOnClick. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I always forget these details, but thank you very much for helping. So, and then I have to invent the name of a function, and I can call it, for example, refresh, without a lot of fantasy, but this will work. You see that here I have a section of methods Now I have to define a method refresh. And I say refresh, call the function that is called self-refresh. Okay? This function, I haven't defined it yet. Okay, but I can define it. And I say self-refresh is equal to a function. Okay? So whatever I write here will be run when somebody presses on the refresh key. What do I do? Well, in order to be fast, because I only have a few minutes, let me do a small simple example. When you click on refresh, I will say like variable new list is equal to, and I get this list, and instead of the New York Times, I have the, I don't know, Washington Post, and instead of the Los Angeles Times, I have the Mercury News from Silicon Valley, and this is from Washington, D.C., okay? So something like this. I mean, it's just the smallest change I can imagine, okay? So imagine I have this new list that in a realistic example I might be getting by doing a call to the server, right? But that's essentially what would happen if once here I plug the right code, I guess. And then I have to say, okay, now I replace the papers with this one. And so what I do is that I say var, self vo. This is why I assign vo to self, right? It's a vo, right? Because now I can access it. It's a member of this object self that I have around, so it's very easy. Self vo papers is equal to new list. That's it, if I haven't made any mistakes. Okay, so let's see whether this works. If I run this code, okay, now I'm here, and if I click refresh, I get the other list. Okay? So there are other things you can do, and next class we will be a little bit more careful about what we do. I mean, we show you more things about being able to, you can insert elements on the list. There are some things you have to be slightly careful about doing, and there are instructions on the documentation side. Essentially, I don't know. I'll watch. But this is the essence. And so what we will be doing next time is this. Instead of getting the new list statically, I want to show you how to do it via a server call. And, your jaw will equally drop about how infinitely simpler is to do a server call to get a list from here. It will be 5 lines of code, perhaps, something like that, 6 max. And then the other challenge, and this will be a little bit harder, is that once we have the list, I will need to make sure that once you click the element of the list, you display the right URL. And that I will be able to do very fast, but it will be an epsilon more awkward for the reason that I don't have a web view. So all I will be able to do is create an iframe, which is the web way of including a web page inside another. But the navigation will be slightly more unpleasant, because once you are in the once you are in the iframe, the user can actually go around as much as they want. I cannot enforce that when you click on a URL that is not part of that news site, you actually jump out to another application. Okay, so I have a little bit less control. This is one of the cases in which Cordova doesn't give you the full control and the full precision of the original Android environment. But in modulo that, we will be able to build our app really with very few lines of code. So so that's it. I will be posting this documentation later today or tomorrow morning, more likely later today, together with this code. The code, I'm actually putting it immediately in the repository so that you know where it is. Git checkout branch like a lecture 2 is the second lecture, okay. Git commit end of class, and git push origin code, git push lecture 2. Okay, so if you go to my Bitbucket, you should see this code, right? You should just be able to see by going to my Bitbucket. I have a bunch of projects, but Cordova Starter App is public and is where this code lives, if you want to reproduce it on your own after this class. Okay? Okay, thank you.